Hello everyone. Thank you for coming to this Opera 101 session on Madama Butterfly. Tonight I'm just going to take you through the synopsis of this, and as I'm going through that, just sort of prime you for a few interesting ideas that are going to come up in question and answer, and also in discussions that our two panelists are going to want to expand on a little bit, and also just to provide an interesting background to this work. Most every opera that I encounter always has an interesting background story of some kind. Heck, you just can't miss it. There's always something that really illuminates how something comes to be, and it just makes our experience so much better. So, for those of you who don't know me, which might well be everybody here, I'm Stephen. Hello, nice to meet you. I'm lecturer in music history and music theory at Ambrose University in Calgary, and I'm a research associate in neuroscience, also at the University of Calgary. So, I give talks on a regular basis for Edmonton Opera, Calgary Opera, and the Canadian Opera Company. So talking about opera is something I love to do, and also have my own music studio. I have over 50 students in my studio, and we just actually had our Marriage of Figaro party, which was Sunday night, which features usually a lot of great food, and we have a lot of people come over, and then I teach Marriage of Figaro, which I didn't do. I taught Così fan tutte instead, and we'll get to Marriage of Figaro at next Thursday's class. But it's a wonderful, expansive way to learn a lot about opera. So I think I'm just going to get started on the presentation, which is right in front of you, with a very succinct title, Puccini's Tale of Love, Hope, and Death. That is Madama Butterfly in a nutshell. I think we can all go home now. It doesn't summarize it from Madama Butterfly's point of view. And there's an awful lot that really I think we can approach from looking inside her and how she sees this through the whole opera, and also the perspectives that are afforded when they look at Butterfly and what she's like. In addition, we're going to try and look at some perspectives on how the West sees Butterfly, and how the West, through its lens of Orientalism at the time, 100 years ago, 110 years ago, when this opera premiered, what that would have been like, and even perhaps today, how we tend to see this. So some slides will be there just to prod us a little bit and see different angles and different lenses, as I say, of this wonderful work. So speaking of angles, artistic and otherwise, one cannot miss the butterfly image. It saturates a lot of posters, presentations, billboards, advertisements, that yes, she is some sort of delicate creature, a butterfly, and I think that with the name, of course, Chocho-san, Chocho meaning butterfly, this becomes readily apparent from the start. But there are those who call her Chocho, and some of us just insist on butterfly alone. That's usually the common parlance, butterfly. And she has changed in her attributes throughout the years. In the original recording score that was put out, she is really rather someone who is at a desperate point in her life where all hope has been bled out of her, quite literally. And all that she has left is her little boy. Of course, that's the final panel where he's blindfolded. She's reaching to him. She doesn't want to give him up, but she has to. And that, of course, is the final heart-wrenching image in a series of cascading crescendo images of loss, and indeed a loss of hope, really going back to the first act, where her first dreams are revealed, and knowing, as we do, being opera fans, that the only real reason in Italian opera that great hopes are revealed is so that they can be crushed and someone can die. This is horrorful, but it is also a truth to life. And so there are various other stylized images, too, that we see on CD, record, video covers. So two Victoria de Los Angeles recordings. I have actually the de Los Angeles Björling recording myself on EMI on the left. I do not have the one with Tito Gobi on the right. I haven't heard that one, but that would be interesting. In fact, I also have the de Los Angeles UC Björling recording of Bohème, which is a very, very curious combination that sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. But they were a remarkable duo for their time. So all of these stylizations take us through different depictions of Butterfly as the changes in how we see her over the decades also change. And I think that's not a bad representation. The two on the right are not quite so similar as one would imagine. One has, I think, a very, very distinct traditional focus at the top, but on the bottom, there is also that sense, too, that with the red and with the overarching feel of that very, very bright coloration and the Japanese flag symbol on her cheek, that she is more like a victim of a national consciousness than she is actually an emblem of hope that has been defeated. So there are all of these different perspectives that are at play here. And I'm not necessarily suggesting we endorse any one, but rather that we treat them all as they come for what they are worth. And there are many, and why not? Butterfly is enormously popular. It's sensationally popular. It's the #7 opera of all time that is performed. And it has that classic aria, Un bel dì, which was the most popular aria to sing in any occasion, for any reason, in the 20th century, until, of course, Nessun Dorma came along. Thank you, Luciano Pavarotti. And that it took something like that to kick Un bel dì out of first place, a constant position that it held for 50 years. So this opera is famous for multiple reasons. And I love this LA Opera picture because, of course, the flowers are also important, not just the butterflies on the right, but the flowers on the left that are going to festoon the house, because they are the ultimate symbol of her hope. The ultimate symbol of knowing that Pinkerton has come back, and to her mind, the only reason that he's there is, of course, finally to make good on the marriage and perhaps take her away. And so the flowers are taken from the garden and put all over the house. It's yet another touching image. And we have to also talk, I think, to some degree about why Puccini does this. I mean, Verdi just doesn't do these sorts of things. You know, Verdi has a different way of working with your heartstrings. So why does Puccini use these kinds of ideas? And of course, this is perhaps one of the most famous. This is the very, very conservative staging by Jean-Pierre Poinel, one of my favorite stagers. And here it is, if you want to have a look at it. This is a remarkable staging with Placido Domingo singing a very, very guilty, shame-faced Pinkerton. And of course, intimately so, one of my favorite sopranos is Morella Freni. Morella Freni is one of those sopranos who has to warm up a bit, and then by the time she gets into Act 2 and then 3, or in something like Don Carlo Act 5, she just gets better and better and stronger and stronger. And this is the case also in this remarkable production. So this is a wonderful video. This is a Carillon conducted Vienna Philharmonic production, and Christa Ludwig plays Suzuki, which is always interesting anytime she sings anything. So this is something also to take in. So there have been video versions of it, there have been multiple versions of this, and there's much that we can look into in really every medium. So let's start back at the beginning. At the top left, Puccini there in the left, and of course, Giacosa and Illica, his librettists, who are in the center there of that top panel. And this was sort of the great trifecta. You know, Illica would take the story, he would turn it into something that was workable, he would whittle it down, get rid of its non-essentials, and then Giacosa would come along and set it to scansion verse of some kind or another. It worked for Bohème, it worked for Tosca, and it worked for Butterfly. Mind you, not without Puccini driving them a little crazy from time to time. But yet, the three men understood each other, and I think that's why these operas are so successful as this great Puccinian Holy Trinity. What happened after that? How come there weren't any other great works after that? I mean, we got Girl of the Golden West after that, which most people really don't like, except me. I love that music. I think it's terrific. And, you know, I don't want to stick up for the concept. There are people out there who just can't stand the work, and I'm not about to argue with them. But the reality is that there was definitely a change in his creative output and in his way of writing. And the reason is because that man on the right, Giacosa, died, which was unfortunate. He died 2 years later, and that really broke up, I think, a winning formula. It's a shame. And to the minds of many people, really, Puccini did not have a major success on the stage, and of course would not have known it because he would have been dead when this happened, except when Turandot came out, and he was just a few mere bars away from completing it when he died of cancer, and that is a shame. So we have to look at Puccini's career after these three great operas as producing wonderful pieces, but nothing of the same majesty and grandeur on a consistent level. Il Trittico with Il Tabarro, a very, very gritty one-act opera. These are three one-act operas, Suor Angelica, and then the comedy Gianni Schicchi, all premiered at the Met, because during the First World War, Well, guess what? Italy was broke. You couldn't really put on operas, so they went to New York where there was money. And out of all of those three, it was the comedy that everybody loved in New York. And after that, Gianna Schicchi stayed in the repertoire forever, and it has since been there. And what a masterpiece that is. That is an absolute little jewel. So, but nothing like Butterfly, unfortunately. This brings us to the fellow seated at the bottom panel. This is David Belasco. Who is David Belasco? It's amazing because no one knows. And when I did a lot of research into him a long time ago and I had to begin teaching Butterfly as a beginning instructor in music, I was astonished at how much this man had influenced Broadway, musical theater, with his plays, how much work he had done in New York, and how much he had started small groups and inspired societies to actually perform. And Butterfly was just one of those things that he took from a short story by John Luther Long, turned into a more elaborate play. And this elaborate play ended up informing Puccini a great deal. But unfortunately, there are differences, and they're sizable, between Belasco's intent of the play and Puccini's get straight to the point to grab your heart approach, really to grab you by the throat approach in his writing of music. And this is something also that I'm hoping that we can talk a little bit about as I go through the slides. Belasco is an ingenious and interesting man and a very fine entrepreneur. He often dressed in black, you know, with a little sort of white kind of cassock-like thing. He wasn't a priest, actually he was an Orthodox Jew. But he always looked like a priest walking around New York, so people sort of, you know, they would laughingly call him, you know, Father Belasco, which he didn't mind, he didn't care at all. But he was actually a very, very shrewd businessman, and he was a very successful man. So Belasco gave the play for both Butterfly and for Girl of the Golden West. Puccini thought he was quite a genius. Catherine, who is actually taking a wonderful film of tonight's proceedings, alerted me to a story that I had long forgotten. And this is, of course, Puccini meeting Belasco after he'd seen the play. He went and saw Butterfly in London. Why was he in London in 1900? Because Tosca was premiering there. And so, before he had to get off to Covent Garden, he went and saw this play, and he said, I've just got to write something about this. And the main reason that he thought that was because, in a way, when we look at Puccini, there's a great scholar named Carl Dahlhaus who says that for Puccini, unlike any other composer, the scenario, the scenery itself, spoke as a character. It wasn't just that it was about Butterfly and Pinkerton, but actually Japan was a full-on character for him. So he was always on the lookout for the scenery becoming that live character. And it didn't matter whether that was something that was completely, totally accurate all the time. It had to serve as a catalyst. In Bohème, for example, La Bohème has nothing to do with real-life bohemians at all. Real-life bohemians got into knife fights, drug deals. They were awful people. So the bohemians that we see are a wonderful middle-class kind of fantasticalization of how we would look at them in this idealized place. What a great way to live on the left bank and just enjoying that sort of life. Well, it was the same for looking at Belasco's play. Japan, wow, what a fabulous place where they have this amazing culture, and can you imagine the repression, and can you imagine that she's, you know, perhaps going to be shunned by her family? But all of the reasons for that got completely changed from what Belasco was after. And as Catherine reminded me, Belasco said, I was convinced, you know, this man with his effusive passion, you know, with practically his hands around my neck telling me how great this was, had no idea really, or just didn't really care what he had just seen. He was only intrigued with the scenario itself. And that is an interesting statement about Puccini, because Puccini, by and large, considered himself not to be a great intellectual. Classes in aesthetics bored him in university. He was not interested. He wanted to get right to the heart of the meaning, of the sentimental, of what was most important about the human heart and how it functioned. And I think this is what has earned sometimes a little bit of discredit from critics. I think wrongly so, because Puccini was a masterful composer, and we're going to talk about that as well. So that's the backdrop to David Belasco and how Puccini met and dealt with him and how he actually worked around in his own mind how he was going to use Belasco's play. So we start with, of course, in Act 1, the fact that Goro is a marriage broker who is leasing this house for 999 years, and this is quite the rental agreement that can be broken at any time. And Pinkerton really kind of says, oh, gee, I like this place, you know, and he kind of finds him a wife who's going to be Butterfly. And he almost has this really rather lax and loose cavalier approach to his commitments in that regard. What he really wants to do, of course, is find himself an American wife. In the Belasco play, this is somebody named Adelaide, a picture that's carried in a trunk everywhere he goes in the Navy. Well, of course, it becomes Kate in this. But he doesn't know Kate yet, but his mind is really in two places. He's using the scenario, he's using the Japanese setting to further his own interests, because he really isn't taking much of this too seriously. It's a lot of fun to him. And so Goro then introduces Pinkerton to his new servants, and one of them is Suzuki, who I think that means floating cloud, if I remember that correctly. And these are household servants, and I always wondered, you know, how did Butterfly get a servant? You have to think about this, it just doesn't make any sense. But that's because this comes from the mother's side of the family. These are servants that she has, and somehow through Goro, the navigation of those servants becomes negotiated to become his responsibility, and so he's going to leave money for them to be paid and so forth. There is a suggestion, therefore, that there's a highborn aspect to Jojo-san that we have to actually come back to and address in a later slide. So it looks like when we get to the end of the opera, the money's probably running out and things are going to start getting desperate, which might add to the scenario of hope being bled out of Butterfly's situation. And here is the American consul in Nagasaki, which is a port city, and that is Sharpless. So there are different ways, of course, to depict the naval-faring Pinkerton. This makes him look like a common seaman without lieutenant's bars. Most people get the rank right. I think in this case, there's always been a sense that, especially in recent years, that they want to portray Pinkerton as a complete scum. And this is what I think is happening here. And Sharpless listens to Pinkerton really describing what he considers to be the good life, that it's all terrific, and Sharpless is just that, utterly unsharp. You know, what his words really just go unheard. He's not, you know, the consul named Sharp, he's Sharpless. And he just agrees with him happily. And they drink to, of course, America. And I'm really sorry that I sort of put in a picture of the boy and Butterfly early, but this was a good close-up of the American flag, and I just really couldn't resist it. And it's really interesting that at this point the Stars and Stripes anthem actually comes into the opera for the first time. And they toast America. There's that sense of, you know, America forever, you know, which you hear this really, when Italians sing it, it's even better. Like, I just love it, you know, just hearing them sing America forever. But it also really shows a very, very sharp divide. You know, the divide is enormous here. We have a world where Nagasaki is kind of like a place to be colonized. And then on the other side, we've got America forever doing the colonizing. So Puccini is very, very careful to show that sort of clear line between the two worlds. But even from our perspective, if we don't say that, and we go back, and we take a step back 100 years, and we say, well, they wouldn't have thought of themselves as that. It's more likely that they would have thought of themselves as Pinkerton, an individual being someone who can set sail, come to a port, find out that life is interesting, take it for everything that it's worth, enjoy it, and then leave. And I think that's much more that sense of the bohemian, the wandering quality that he's trying to build into Pinkerton. And that should become a nationalist characteristic for America, seen from an Italian point of view, I think is much closer to the truth of 100 years ago. So the geishas arrive, and Butterfly comes up the hill, and they sing all the way up the hill, which is quite beautiful. And they typically sing in this beautiful, and this is sort of one of the earliest senses we get of Puccini mining Japanese scales and Japanese intervals in trying to bring this material into life. Of course, Un Bel Di is going to be the classic way in which he will do that. And the humming chorus, of course, at the end of Act 2 that everybody knows. And with this, we are reminded precisely of what the economic situation is for Cho-Cho-san. She is to be a geisha. Now, in the Belasco play, the high-born Cho-Cho-san is probably being exchanged for money. She's being trained to become a dancer. So what that leads to next in terms of the context of what geisha means is left ambiguous by John Luther Long, by David Belasco, by Puccini, by everybody. But at the age of 15, we can only guess what that might lead to. And it really might well be a part of the economic climate of the time that a high-born family would do that with their daughter, because perhaps there is a money issue at stake. And so what follows with all of these geishas is a sense that there is a community that she's part of. And it also follows, too, that how her family treats her is of interest to us economically. It could be that the family would have wanted her to marry somebody nobler, higher, but an American naval officer will do, because it looks like it's a chance to actually bring her inside to money. And there is someone else actually in, of course, the field, and we know that that's Yamadori, and we'll get to him in Act 2. But Yamadori has his own backstory as well, that Puccini had to work with, and had to work with in his own succinct way, and we'll come to him. But suffice to say that a lot of the family backstory in this opera was cut after the debut in 1904, because one of the problems with this opera was that it was too long. One of the earliest problems was that Act 1, as we understand it, stood, but Act 2 was Act 2 plus Act 3. And it gets worse. Not only was there a lot of backstory in Act 1 that had to be slashed out, but when Belasco's play went up in front of Puccini, one of the most entrancing parts, and what's called by writers as a theatrical tour de force, which surely would have appealed to Puccini, who was the master of the theatrical, was this 15-minute pantomime that breaks out, where the humming chorus now is, to actually show and depict night passing into day, and all of her hopes and her dreams being played out in this very, very subtle and quasi-Japanese manner that Belasco was trying to lead to. 14 minutes of it. And in the debut, Puccini tried his best to copy that. It was not successful. It is hard to do that in opera for that long. Pantomime and miming of any kind works best in opera, frankly, during the overture, because this is what we're used to now. We're used to people coming out and miming actions, sort of as backstory. Pre-opera, really. And this is something of a pioneering attempt, and a first attempt that really did not go well. So he had to change it, and that's how the humming chorus got written, which is interesting. So when we look at this backstory, this family backstory, it was it was a trouble. It was a problem for a while. And when these geishas enter, behind those geishas is a whole sense of economic insecurity. Would she have lived with them? Would she have lived with her mother? It's likely she would have lived with her mother, but she was going to live with her fellow geishas if the marriage to Pinkerton had not come along. So it really prompts a question. Is her hope as a highborn girl to escape a geisha life and go to America, where things would be just a lot better being married to a man who she imagines is going to love her forever? So the hope tied to economics, tied to family background, and tied to approval is enormous. The weight on her is absolutely enormous in this opera. And I think that's something that many of us have to try and come to appreciate if we want to get inside something more than just the music. So here's a lovely panel from, I think this is lyric opera, where Butterfly describes herself as the happiest girl in Japan. And that's one of her first lines. And with all the backstory that I've just told you, now we know why. So that's a bit of Belasco plus Puccini that's been cut, plus what we know put in. I mean, there's 3 stories going on here, you know, which is really remarkable. So this happiest girl of all greets Pinkerton, and she tells her that her mother is still alive, but she's very, very poor, and she won't speak of her father because I think the Mikado made him commit suicide, I think, if I recall, in the story itself. So in this version, Puccini just gets to the point. My mom's poor, don't worry, it'll all be fine. I'm sorry I can't bring you a big dowry. I think that's really what the effect of that is. But in the backstory, what it really was that their money was running out, not that they just had reached being poor. So we kind of come to the central problem that's going to really rip all of this open. As I've said, Pinkerton's really not taking much of this seriously. Sharpless starts to get concerned. He starts to get a little sharper. And he warns Pinkerton that Butterfly really believes in this marriage. And you better too, because you're going to hurt her and you're going to let her down unless you start to rise to this occasion. Because he's laughing and making jokes. What to our morality would be, you know, they're really sort of, oh, look at the funny people in the funny hats and the funny costumes, kinds of humor. I mean, it's really horrific. You kind of look at it and you just kind of cringe. But it's also, when we were talking last night and recording the Edmonton Opera podcast between Catherine and myself, it's like, as Catherine said to me, you know, a good Pinkerton is someone who, you know, if he's done his job, leaves the audience hating him by the end. And I think this is really what the objective is here. Black and white characterizations are not my thing. I don't think they're really many opera writers' things. I mean, you know, Pinkerton is not so black and white, but he sure is at this point. So, Sharpless then, I think, tries to get Pinkerton to take it a little bit more seriously, and reluctantly joins him in a toast. And you get different paths at this point. How seriously does Pinkerton take this marriage? It depends on which path you take. If it's in the John Luther Long story, very seriously. If it's in the Belasco story, it's somewhat seriously. And if it's in the Butterfly, the Puccini story, then it depends. The director will sometimes have Pinkerton be quite earnest and be actually a really nice guy, or sometimes they have him just continue being a jerk. So there are different ways to match it, but the music, if you analyze the music, it suggests that actually it's quite intense. And why? We all know the answer, don't we? Because what follows is one of the most beautiful love duets ever written in the history of opera. I would suggest that Butterfly and Pinkerton are an item, and Pinkerton is trying to take this as seriously as he can. He's swept up by her, and why not? Because he's swept up by her innocent charms. He's also swept up by her dreams, and he kind of looks and says, oh, here's this lovely person who trusts me. I think I'm in love. But what does that mean deep down for a naval officer who is itinerant? Well, we all know the answer to that, unfortunately. But for intensity, try Cary Grant. Isn't this wonderful? I mean, I love this guy. I think he's absolutely wonderful. I mean, I thought he was one of the greatest actors. And, you know, in spite of I mean, I can't imagine him saying, "Yeah, butterfly, my dear," or anything like that. But I'm sure it was probably a lot more deep than something like Tony Curtis doing an impersonation of him, which I've just done. I would locate this between post-World War II and 1980, that they almost all look like this. Unless there's some great productions out there that you've seen, and you can tell me that I'm wrong, because I love to be told that I'm wrong. It happens a lot. But this, to me, is really what I think we dealt with for quite a while. So, the wedding contract gets signed, and the guests are having what looks like could be a good time. There are members, distant members of the family often, that are brought in. And then, the original, this is the Bonza, this is her Shinto priest relative, an uncle. This guy is the original wedding crasher. So he comes in and curses her before all the guests, and we're kind of stuck with this strange, but albeit typical Puccinian intervention. It's like, plot twist, you know, I mean, he doesn't care whether it works or not. But apparently she's converted to Christianity without telling anybody. He comes in, curses her, the guests are appalled, they all leave, and she's left with Pinkerton alone as this converted Christian and no longer a Buddhist. Well, that didn't happen in the original at all. In fact, the original was much more complex. What happened in the original that made everyone upset and the difficulty was that the family wanted her to marry somebody wealthier. And the Bonza is actually somebody who's upset that there have been cultural lines crossed, there have been taboos crossed, there's money issues here. All of the things that I've mentioned are much more the original, what the original Bonza was objecting to. So I think that Puccini found that for dramatic sake, he had to cut it all down and just make it about one thing, to make Act One come together. Because he has to isolate her somehow, doesn't he? I mean, the composer, if he doesn't isolate Cho-Cho-san, we don't have quite as searing a tragedy in Act Three, and this was his way of dealing with it. And this is a completely Puccinian made-up idea, or perhaps with his librettos, we don't know. So that's how we got to this character. But she is happy, and this is a San Francisco Opera poster, which I really like. This of course results in that tenderest of love duets of all time. And you know, her innocence is revealed here, her expectations, her dreams, and you know, she's just absolutely happy beyond belief that she can, no matter what, with her relatives gone, with all of her friends gone, all of it is made up for the fact that he's there, and that's more or less what she says. And that's how Act One ends. That's the best way to end an act, is with a love duet. It worked in Bohème, why can't it work here? So, from here, we go to Act Two, and the moment that absolutely everybody not only waits for, but just, I think it's just so spine-tingling. He hasn't returned for 3 years, and he said, you know, Pinkerton said he would be back with the robin's nest, and she is sort of wondering when that is. You know, she's not sure what the life cycle of a robin is over in America. And Suzuki is trying to perhaps influence her. It's the first test by evidence that maybe he's not coming back, and she shushes him off. She shushes her away and sings this splendid aria in G-flat major, which is a very rare key to sing an aria in, frankly, even for this time. And begins high on G-flat, another rare thing to do. Nobody comes out and just pops G-flat and then sings thirds and sings fourths all the way down in what is supposed to be a quasi-Japanese, slightly modified pentatonic way of writing. The construction of this piece is interesting because it is loosely da capo. That means it'll come back. But it also has something of a conversational pattern in the middle of it too. There's all kinds of different melodic and vocal writing styles that get thrown into this piece. And my guess is that it has to do with Puccini's consistent, persistent badgering of the Japanese consul with whom he was friends in Italy, and the constant visits he paid to his wife, asking her to sing, to read poetry to him, to tell him about all of the Japanese culture that they knew at the time. And from all of this, he gained an insight into how he thought he might have to write un bel di. So this is his best attempt at trying to distill and put together a lot of the culture. I think that it happens in the music. I don't think it happens successfully in the action. And I think that's an important distinction to make. The music is masterful. When he's studying culture, for Puccini, he's studying musical representation. When he's studying drama, he's only studying what he wants. So Sharpless arrives, and this is a National Opera Britain moment, and he reads the letter to her, and she keeps interrupting him. She doesn't quite understand what the intonations are of the letter. She keeps saying, well, he said he would come back with Robin's Nest. Maybe they nest every 3 years there instead of here where they nest every year. So she's very, very innocent about this. And Sharpless really just can't get back to the letter to try and say, well, you know, when he comes back, he doesn't intend to see you. This is what the telegram says. Meanwhile, Goro shows up with Yamadori, the man who in the Belasco play had been around since Act 1, trying to marry Cho-Cho-san. And Goro, of course, ends up telling Sharpless that Butterfly's family, because of the Christian conversion, has now disowned her, and she is as poor as dirt can be at this juncture. So when Sharpless reveals that, it's actually a very, very shocking moment in its own regard, that it really points to the brutality that she is facing in her own situation. But, you know, it's only a matter of time before we know what's going to be revealed next. And when Sharpless tries to read the letter again to Butterfly, he gets to the point where he says, I'm coming back to Japan, and she gets so excited that she cuts him off, and she is absolutely so thrilled that she brings out her little boy, who in the play is called Trouble, but in the opera is called Sadness, Dolore. And she brings out Sadness and says when he comes back, his name will be transferred to Joy. And so in this transformation that she's hoping for, this huge hope, I think that we get our cocooned insect, our cocooned caterpillar transformed to a butterfly. I think we get all of the floral imagery and the blooming of that hope really starting to become very, very prominent at this point. Sharpless says, yeah, but take Yamadori's proposal, and she just blows him off again and again and again. So Sharpless at one point asks, well, what will you do if he doesn't return? And she says, I'll never dance again, and I will just sing a sad song in the streets, and then I'd rather die than lead a life of dishonor. So it becomes really clear. I mean, the trajectory of the opera becomes very, very clear after that. So this is the famous spotting the ship scene, you know, with the spyglass where she looks out at the bay, and she's been looking for years. She's been trying to read the flags on ships for years, and finally it's an American flag, and it's the Abraham Lincoln, which is Pinkerton's ship. She's overjoyed, as you can see. That's about the best overjoyed slide I could find. And she festoons the house with, of course, Americana and with a lot of beautiful flowers. They go out to the garden, they take absolutely everything. And this is done in very, very different ways, in backdrop, in foreground. This is the Seattle Opera version of it. And it's funny how Seattle Opera actually took the marketing approach of saying that this was going to be a butterfly to convert the haters. I don't know if they succeeded. And then there's sort of the IKEA version of Butterfly. And you know, this is, but this is necessary because in the modernization where we take a teenager to be an adult, which is very important 100 years ago, nowadays she just wouldn't be. And this was done with Così fan tutte, for example, you know, where Fiordalici and Dorabella are 15 and 16 years old in that opera, and they're dressed like schoolgirls. Adam McGoyan had them dressed like they were going to a private school. It was creepy and weird. It really was. But by Act 2, it worked in another way because it managed to get across why the lessons of love in the School for Love, which is the subtitle of Mozart's Così, actually come to pass. So actually taking people back to their age and depicting them in these modern settings is very, very important. And it takes us again inside the psychodynamic of what these characters really are like and how they are thinking. So perhaps it brings it home all the more why hope, love, coming together become, for Puccini, one of his favorite topics, and that is death. With Puccini, and I just want to just insert this as a side bubble, and I thank you for your patience with this. With Puccini, one of the most important things is to actually move to sadism and a loss of dignity. This is not a sadistic opera in the physical sense, the way Turandot is. Or Tosca, for example, where there's outright torture going on and Tosca has to endure it. This is a different kind of pain. We're the ones who are being tortured by watching Butterfly bit by bit by bit, and we're the ones who see the loss of hope before she can see it. That's what makes this the worst of all. And this is yet another typical Puccinian study. Mimi, Butterfly are of a type. Cavaradossi, Tosca, Turandot, Prince Caliph are of another type. But the eros and sadism component, the cruelty that absolutely obsessed Puccini, and he confessed that he was obsessed with it, is something of a typical movement in writing called verismo, or realism. And the veristi, the composers and the writers, wanted to get away from the romantic, high-flown issue of, well, we have this ideal and we're always trying to maintain it. Well, the veristi said, let's just step back from the ideal and actually go down into the mud, and actually go down to where life really is lived, in poverty, like Bohème, or in the mountains, where you have just the playing out of raw passions, like Carmen. So they wait, the sun sets, they tear 3 spy holes through the shoji screen, and they wait for Pinkerton to arrive. She tries to stay up all night, and she falls asleep, and she's bundled to bed with her boy. And of course, that's the famous humming chorus scene. This is the best humming chorus slide I could find. It's sort of muted and beautiful, and you can almost hear it when you look at these colors. And they're off stage too, which I quite like. This is not an original concept. Verdi did this in Rigoletto and a couple of other of his operas too from the time period. So the whole party arrives with, of course, Kate Pinkerton. And Suzuki explains how Butterfly knows Pinkerton has arrived. For the past 3 years, whenever a ship arrived, she would look out and see that flag, or look for that flag. But Sharpless tells Suzuki that Pinkerton has brought the American wife with him, Kate. And Suzuki knows right away that the sun has gone down and it's over. And so it really becomes clear through the conversation to Pinkerton what's happening, because he sees the house festooned with flowers, the American flag, the hope that something he just did not know he would have really unleashed is going to come to fruition, and he's really there to what amounts to being to stomp out everything good that she might well have really believed could have happened for her. And this is really a very extreme case. I mean, if this were to happen today in our culture, I don't think it could ever be quite so, but it is very possible still to do this to someone, even though it is not so extreme. These things happen in relationships a lot, and I have the feeling this is what makes this opera so wonderful. That's my personal take. I think that there are a million reasons why people love this opera, as there are a million fans for it. Butterfly comes out. She senses that he is there. She sees Kate. Her life is over. She knows the truth. And this is where she acquires some of her finest, greatest, and most beautiful dignity. It is a peculiar time for that to happen, but many of us have been in these situations where we have to show our dignity at the absolute worst of times, when we are under the worst stressor. And Cho-Cho-san does just that. It is quite wonderful. However, it is not quite wonderful, because oh, somebody just came online, sorry about that. I think I'll just ignore that. That's quite an unsatisfactory denouement to my serious message. I'm so sorry. But Butterfly agrees to give the boy up, and Pinkerton leaves. He's told, come back in a half hour and I will do this, because 30 minutes, of course, is all that she needs to do, you know what. And really, in reality, Pinkerton admits out and out that he's a coward. He runs off, that he just cannot face her, because he cannot face what he has done. And this is a great scene, a classic scene, and I think this is likely the original promotion for the original play. I'm trying to trace it, but it's at least vintage to that. And of course, we know what happens. The boy is blindfolded, so he cannot see her suicide. And the American flag is not jingoism. She does place the flag in his hand, and he's supposed to wave it, actually, so that when he does come in and screams her name, the little boy is there holding the flag, which is a typical Puccinian thing to do. I mean, I think it's horrific, and it's dramatically reckless by our standards, there's no doubt. But for 1904, it would have been perfect to do just that. And all the flowers around, of course, festooning it, which become, of course, the flowers of death, rather than the flowers of love and hope. And you know, they're just striking different ways to see this. I mean, we can't miss the tenderness of her farewell to her boy, saying, you know, I didn't do this because I ran away. I did this to save you. You know, I didn't do this because I was ashamed of you. I did this for quite the opposite reason. And it just rips you in half, and then it rips you in half again and again and again. So it's an unbelievable ending. And you have different ways of doing it, contemplating the knife, like the San Francisco Opera portrait. Notice how the Buddhist imagery is back in. And then, of course, moving behind the screen to commit the final act. And this is, I believe, a National Opera Britain silhouette, which is about as dramatic as it possibly can get. That's what I saw when I was 6. That was my first opera. My first opera was a screen. I said, except that I said to my mother, is she going to kill herself now? And everybody in the first 3 rows heard that. And so there's a lot of giggling right before the suicide. I ruined the suicide scene. I'm so sorry to all those people. But this is a very serious moment, because it is not just the loss of life and not just the loss of honor, that she is going to commit suicide because it's better to die without honor than live with dishonor, she says. It is about something, ultimately, that this really, I think, cuts to the heart of this opera, just like all of these other messages. Butterfly's life stands for something of a freedom that is taken away. It stands for everything that every teenage girl who falls in love with opera loves about characterization. It is to be free to sing that role. They love Carmen just as much. So there was a great teacher who I really, really love a lot in Toronto named Stuart Hamilton. And Stuart Hamilton said, this is every 16 to 18-year-old young singer's favorite opera. And they relate to it. They don't relate to the suicide or the dishonor. What they relate to is the freedom and the beauty of being able to hope for something so radiant and wonderful. And in the end, Mr. Hamilton always said they never imagined that it could happen to them. And that's the one thing about hope that's so astonishing, is that you might have a nagging doubt, but you never believe that it's going to end like this. And this is precisely the power of Puccini's story. He makes it end like this as best as he possibly can, to make it as tragic as it possibly could be, because sometimes it does end something like this for many people, perhaps not as bluntly and as directly, but it's certainly in the world of opera, with its extravagance, its extremeness of message, it really delivers the final knockout blow, and it stays with us forever, that yes, this can happen, this does happen. And how do we hope for something better than this? We go to a different opera. That's the only way. And that's, I think, what gives us this such incredible power. And I can't wait to hear it sung, and I know it's going to be sung really, really well by a wonderful Edmonton opera group and cast. I think they've just got it. And I think now we have to move on to talk a little bit more about Japan itself, and then talk to Kim after that, talk to Dr. Fujiwara, and then talk to Ms. Kim and Taiswana about those very things. Thank you.